Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row that mark our place. And in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
That haunting voice you just heard carrying In Flanders Fields by John McCrae was none other than the late, great Leonard Cohen. He was unyielding, timeless, and among Canada's finest poetic souls. So it feels profoundly fitting that one Canadian poet should give voice to the words of another. Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Memory and Valor, a podcast dedicated to resurrecting the individual stories and quiet sacrifices of Canadian veterans. I'm your host, Samantha McCrae. Thank you for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. This week, as promised, we will look at the Battle of Hill 70, also known as Canada's Forgotten Victory, and the impact that that battle had on my family. Much of what I'm going to relate to you today has been documented in my first book, which is called Ancestors Sitting Between Us, which also explores the concept of ancestral memory, also known as cellular memory, and in scientific circles, it's called epigenetics. Shameless book plug there, I know, but it's a very cool concept. So our story begins, strangely enough, with a farewell. Spring 1911. Imagine Dalbeattie, Scotland, a town of rolling green hills and stone cottages where the rhythm of life was measured by the sound of chisels striking granite. This was the Milburn family's home. Alexander, the patriarch, was a stonemason whose hands had shaped slate and granite into permanence. Alexander was also my great-grandfather. His craft was steady, his work respected, but in the spring of 1911, he made a decision that would change everything. He chose to leave it all behind. So picture him standing at the threshold of that choice, a man with calloused hands looking out across the Atlantic toward a future he could not yet see. He gathered his wife Mary and their 6 children, each carrying a piece of the family's hope. Among them was a small girl named Maggie Jane, born in 1905 in Scotland. She was only 6 years old when they left, wide-eyed and curious, clutching her mother's dress as they boarded the ship bound for Quebec in Canada. Maggie Jane would grow up to be my grandmother. But in that moment, she was simply a child stepping into the unknown, her father's courage shaping the path ahead. And so their journey carried them across the ocean to Canada, where they settled in Iberville, Quebec, a quiet town along the Richelieu River. Life there was unfamiliar. The neighbors spoke French. The winters bit with a cold they had never known in Galloway, and the maple trees stood where oaks once had. But stone doesn't care what country it's crafted in. Alexander found stonecutters' work within the small, picturesque village of Iberville, steady and honest, shaping foundations not only from rock, but for his children's future. For 5 years, the family carved out a rhythm. It was modest, it was hard, but it was real. Another son, a seventh child, would be born in Canada in very late 1916. This chapter of the Milburn story doesn't begin in a trench. It begins with a stonemason stepping into snow and silence, choosing sacrifice over certainty. When Alexander Richardson Milburn joined the Canadian Engineers, he had brought with him the skills honed in Dalbeattie and Iberville: precision, strength, and an instinct for infrastructure. The engineers weren't just soldiers, they were lifelines. In the midst of devastation, they built trenches, roads, bridges, and dugouts. They laid wire in the dark. They repaired what shell fire shattered. Alexander's enlistment wasn't the romantic image of cavalry charges or teenage volunteers aflame with patriotism. It was sober, skilled, and essential. The war didn't just need heroes, it needed craftsmen. And that's what he brought to the field. His unit, the 2nd Field Company, became the invisible backbone of the Canadian Corps. They worked under fire, pushed through mud, and built platforms where infantry would soon bleed. The very ground that soldiers stood on in combat may have held the traces of their labor, if not their names, then their care. By 1916, the war had already chewed through the first wave of eager volunteers. The boys who had rushed to enlist in 1914 full of fire and patriotism were now gone. Many buried in soil that wasn't theirs, their names etched into stone memorials across Europe. The call for men grew desperate. Canada needed more, and the war machine kept turning. And this is where the Milburn story takes a turn that defies the usual war narrative. He wasn't alone. Another Milburn family member answered the call, a generation younger and bound to him by blood. His nephew, William Glendenning Milburn, was just 18 years old. Now, William was the son of Mary Milburn, Alexander's younger sister. He was born in Scotland but raised in Canada. William had settled in Barrie, Ontario. He was a young husband, married to a woman named Flora, and already facing the responsibilities of adulthood when he enlisted as Private 643-275 in the 75th Battalion, Canadian Infantry. William stepped into the same current of history that was pulling his uncle forward. So here we have them, two Milburn men, uncle and nephew. Alexander, the seasoned stonemason turned sapper, carrying wire, spools, and timber to shape the battlefield, and William, the young infantryman, rifle in hand, stepping into the storm of combat. One driven by duty, the other youthful resolve and the weight of family responsibility. Bound together by blood, by courage, and by the same grim Atlantic crossing destiny. When Alexander Richardson Milburn enlisted in January 1916, his path led him first to Valcartier Camp near Quebec City. It's several hours north of Iberville. So the engineers were not trained for glory charges, they were trained for endurance. Alexander's days were filled with the rhythm of construction, hammering, sawing, measuring, but now under the constant reminder that every structure would be tested by shell fire. His hands, once used to shaping permanence, were now preparing for destruction and repair in equal measure. Meanwhile, William Glendenning Milburn, his nephew, was beginning his own journey with the 75th Battalion, Canadian Infantry. At just 18, William's training was harsher and more relentless. The infantry were the tip of the spear. They were at the sharp end, and their preparation reflected that. Imagine him at Camp Borden in Ontario or later at Bramshot in England, learning to march in formation, to fire and clean his rifle until it gleamed, to fix bayonets and charge across open ground. His training was about aggression, about pushing forward through fear, about becoming part of a machine designed to seize and hold ground. Where Alexander's world was timber, wire, and tools, William's was mud, rifles, and the weight of a pack that seemed heavier with every mile of drill. He learned to crawl through trenches, to endure gas drills with masks strapped tight to his face, to march until his legs probably burned. His instructors drilled into him the brutal truth: the infantry would bear the brunt of the fighting. And yet, despite their differences, their paths were already intertwined. Alexander went to Shorncliffe, where engineers trained under pressure to build under fire, while William went to Bramshot and Whitley, where infantry battalions drilled endlessly, preparing for the mud and the blood of France. So, two Milburn men, one learning to build lifelines in the chaos of war, the other preparing to fight in the thick of it, uncle and nephew. Their experience is different, but their destinies already converging on the same battlefield. By the time Alexander Richardson Milburn completed his training, the war had already reshaped him. At Valcartier and later Shorncliffe in England, he had learned to turn his mason's instincts into military craft. So by now he knew how to lay wire in the dark, how to build bridges under pressure, and how to dig trenches that might hold against bombardment. His tools were picks, shovels, timber, and spools of wire, the lifelines of the Canadian engineers. When he crossed the channel into France, the reality of war hit with full force. The land was scarred, cratered, and silent except for the distant rumble of artillery. For Alexander, the front was not about charging with a rifle, it was about shaping survival. His section of the 2nd Field Company was tasked with building saps. Saps are narrow approach trenches that sort of snaked towards the enemy lines, and also reinforcing dugouts so that infantry could shelter when the guns opened up. So every night was spent under fire, hammering boards into mud, like the duck boards, also called duck walks, stringing wire across shattered ground, and repairing what shells had destroyed. His war was one of endurance, of sweat and silence, and of building in the shadows while the horizon burned. William Glendinning Milburn's arrival in France was different. As a private in the 75th Battalion, his training had prepared him for the brutal reality of trench warfare. He crossed the Channel with his battalion, landing at Le Havre before moving into the staging areas near the front. For William, the war was immediate and visceral. He learned to live in the trenches, so he would have been knee-deep in mud, surrounded by the stench of cordite and decay. His pack carried rations, ammunition, and a rifle that had to be cleaned daily, even when the rain never stopped. Where Alexander's nights were spent building lifelines, William's were spent waiting for orders, listening to the whistle of shells overhead, and bracing for the next advance. He would have drilled in bayonet practice, learning to crawl through wire, and endured gas mask drills that left him probably gasping for air. His war was about aggression, about holding the line, and about being ready to surge forward when the barrage lifted. And yet, despite these differences, their paths were converging, and they probably had no idea. Both men were now in France, both part of the Canadian Corps, preparing for something monumental. So the stage was set. The land itself probably seemed to groan under the weight of anticipation, and soon both William and Alexander would find themselves drawn into the same storm, the Battle of Hill 70. In the weeks leading up to the assault, the engineers' work was constant and pretty intense. They would have labored under the shadow of bombardment, constructing concealed saps, installing barbed wire, and reinforcing every possible communication route. But the single greatest adversary wasn't German steel, it was the earth itself. The farmlands, once fertile, had been completely annihilated by shelling, transformed into a grotesque consuming quagmire. Continuous rain ensured the mud was deep enough to swallow men whole. And that is no exaggeration. We can listen to the voices of those who were there. Private James Clancy wrote home, quote, "The mud is incredible, sticky and deep. You'd think we were wading through porridge. I saw 2 men buried when a shell struck beside them and the muck closed in over their heads like water. It's not just the bullets we fear, it's the ground itself." End quote. And Sergeant William Henry Billings, fighting nearby, painted a similar picture. He wrote, quote, "I have never seen such a desolation. The fields are blasted, the trees gone. Duckboards are our lifeline, and if you step off, you vanish." End quote. So the land itself had become a weapon, and this is very well documented in soldiers' and veterans' diaries and interviews post war. For Alexander Milburn, the mud was his work site. His daily challenge was to impose order in chaos. The official war diaries of the 2nd Field Company are chillingly stoic. One entry states, "Work commenced on forward sap under heavy shelling. Mud waist deep. 1 man lost in crater. Progress slow but steady." End quote. 50 years after World War I ended, interviews with veterans were conducted for CBC radio, a program called Flanders Fields, which originally first aired on November 11th, 1964. Gregory Clark was a major and then, interesting later, a lieutenant with the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles and also a Military Cross recipient. Gregory Clark was born in Toronto, Ontario in 1892. He listed his next of kin on his attestation paper as his mother, and they lived at 66 Howland Avenue in Toronto, a beautiful home that still exists. He was awarded the Military Cross for Vimy Ridge on July 26, 1917. His citation in part reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty, he assumed command of and led his company with great ability, gained his objective, and consolidated the position. He set a fine example of courage and initiative." End quote. But here's the thing. He was the only surviving officer in his company. In this 1964 interview with the CBC, Gregory Clark talks about the conditions of battle.
Everything turned into porridge, a ghastly, dreadful porridge, thigh deep, in which if you got hit on the shoulder blade with a bullet that merely knocked you unconscious for 2 minutes, you drowned. We lost lots of men who simply drowned because they were knocked over or stunned and couldn't be recovered before they'd sunk in the mud.
Clark became a well-known journalist and humorist with the Toronto Star and died in 1977. He's buried in Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Toronto. So it's a testament to endurance. Alexander and his comrades were the quiet, indispensable scaffolding of the entire operation, working tirelessly to lay duckboards and wire that would allow the infantry to even attempt their charge. And among that infantry was his nephew, William Glendenning, of the 75th Battalion. So for William, the mud was not a work site, it was a trap. Every step forward was a battle against exhaustion. Every trench a place where boots stuck fast and rifles clogged with filth. His battalion spent those weeks rehearsing attacks, hauling supplies, and bracing for the counter barrage they knew would come. Nights were spent in waterlogged dugouts, if you can imagine. Sometimes the water in these dugouts and trenches could be knee deep, listening to the shells whistle overhead and waiting for the order to move. Duckboards were their lifelines, and William knew that stepping off of one could mean vanishing into the mire forever. So you can picture it. Alexander, older, steady, hammering boards into mud, stringing wire in silence, shaping the battlefield so others could fight, and William, younger and tense, rifle in hand, trudging through the same mud, knowing that soon he would be asked to charge across it. So we've painted this picture of uncle and nephew, the builder and the fighter, both swallowed by the same landscape and both preparing for the same storm in this parallel world, and again, likely having no idea that the other was there. So we're going to talk about the actual first day of the Battle of Hill 70. So it's the early hours of August 15th, 1917. The night air is damp. It's heavy with the smell of mud, smoke, cordite, and somewhere in the trenches, watches are checked and rechecked and synced, every second ticking toward 4:25 a.m., 0 hour. A creeping barrage was a revolutionary artillery tactic developed during World War I designed to overcome the deadly stalemate of trench warfare. So rather than halting bombardment before the infantry advanced, as was common early in the war, this method involved firing shells in timed incremental stages just ahead of the attacking troops. So the barrage advanced at a very calculated pace, often at a rate of 50 to 100 meters per minute, kind of creating like a curtain of explosions that suppressed the enemy defenders and shredded barbed wire and disrupted enemy trench systems. This allowed the infantry to follow closely behind, shielded from direct fire, and able to seize ground before the enemy could regroup. So at the Battle of Hill 70, the Canadian Corps employed this technique with remarkable precision. The barrage was meticulously coordinated, using detailed maps, synchronized watches, and ensuring that infantry units could advance in lockstep with the artillery without falling victim to friendly fire. The success of the operation hinged on this timing. Any miscalculation could result in catastrophic losses. The psychological impact was immense for both the attackers who relied on the barrage for protection and for the defenders who were forced to remain under cover, disoriented, and unable to mount effective resistance. So, more than just a tactical innovation, the creeping barrage marked a shift toward integrated warfare, where artillery and infantry operated in tandem, foreshadowing modern combined arms strategies. And remember that this battle was Sir Arthur Currie's first command. He was now commander of the entire Canadian Corps, having taken the place of Julian Byng. So Hill 70 was his sort of baptism of fire, so to speak. And while Arthur Currie, because he was an officer, he was a brilliant man. He wasn't great in the field, but behind the lines and making the planning, he was, again, brilliant. So then it begins. The ground trembles as Canadian artillery roars to life. Shells scream overhead, tearing into the earth in perfect rhythm. Boom, boom, boom. Each explosion lands just ahead of the trenches, rolling forward like a tide of fire. This is the creeping barrage, a wall of destruction moving across no man's land, 50 to 100 meters at a time. Try to imagine standing there, feeling the shock waves in your chest, the air vibrating with thunder and the sky flashing with fire. For William Glendinning, the barrage is both lifeline and terror. He would have crouched low, rifle clutched tight, mud sucking at his boots, his heart pounding so hard it feels louder than the guns. He knows the plan. Stay close behind the curtain of shells. Too far back, and you lose its protection. Too close, and you risk being torn apart by your own artillery. So every step forward will be a gamble. The smoke is thick, stinging his eyes, and the ground ahead is already a churned wasteland of craters and wire. But the barrage is his shield and the only thing standing between him and the Germans' guns waiting on the ridge. Alexander's experience is different. Again, he's older, steadier, and an engineer. While William braces for the charge, Alexander shoulders a spool of wire, a pick, and timber. His job isn't to fight head on, it's to follow in the wake of the barrage and turn chaos into something usable. So as the infantry pushes forward, Alexander and his comrades will move in behind, laying duckboards over craters, stringing wire, and reinforcing trenches and trying to carve order out of devastation. So you can picture him trudging forward, mud up to his knees or higher, the roar of artillery still echoing in his ears. He's not firing his rifle, he's carrying his tools. He knows that as soon as the infantry moves on, it's his turn to build under fire. So his work will decide whether the men who survive the charge can hold the ground they've taken. So you can see it. William stepping into the smoke and flame, every nerve alive with fear and determination, and Alexander carrying the weight of responsibility, trudging behind with wire spools and timber, knowing that his role is to make survival possible. Two men, same family, same battle. One charging forward into the storm, the other following close behind to shape the ground they've just fought for. Both caught in the rhythm of the barrage, both living that morning in completely different ways. And yet, in that moment, their experiences are bound together by the same thunder, the same mud, the same fire rolling across Hill 70. I'd like to read to you now from a book called The Great War as I Saw It. It was written in 1922 by Canon Frederick George Scott, and he was the senior chaplain of the 1st Canadian Division, CEF. And he basically kept a diary throughout the entire war. And he was a chaplain on the move. He was a guy, he didn't stay, at RHQ. He didn't stay in the chateaus. He preferred to stay kind of in the trenches with the men, just offering counsel and peace wherever he could. So these are his memoirs, his notes, his diary when it came to Hill 70. And he wrote, the barrage was to begin at 4:25 in the morning, so the gunner and I went down into a dugout and tried to get a little rest. Before we got to sleep, however, we became aware of the smell of gas, and hearing the tramping of feet in the trench at the top of the stairs, I went up and found the men of the 14th Battalion with their helmets on, going forward in preparation for the advance. They recognized me because I did not put on my mask, and as they passed, they shook hands with me, and I wished them good luck in the name of the Lord. Such cheery souls they were, going forth in their stifling helmets to the unknown dangers which awaited them. And when he refers to stifling helmets, he is talking about the gas masks or the respirators that they wore. He goes on to say, I found that sleep was impossible, so I went up to the OP and waited for the barrage. It was a lovely night. The stars were shining beautifully, and the constellation of Orion hung on the horizon in the eastern sky with a pale moon above. A great silence, stirred only by the morning breeze, brooded over the wide expanse of darkness. Then, at 4:25, the guns burst forth in all their fury, and all along the German line I saw not only exploding shells, but the bursting oil drums with their pillars of liquid fire, whose smoke rose high in the air with a peculiar turn at the top, which looked like the neck of a huge giraffe. At once the Germans sent up rockets of various colors, signaling for aid from their guns, and the artillery duel of the two great armies waxed loud and furious. I stood on the hill with some of our men and watched the magnificent scene. Nothing but the thought of what it meant to be human beings took away from our enjoyment of the mighty spectacle. It's very interesting to hear the different perspectives on an opening barrage at 0 hour and how it looked depending on whose side you were on. Um, so basically, 4:25 a.m. was the opening barrage. To intensify the chaos, the Canadians unleashed Livens projectors. They were crude but devastating weapons that hurled burning drums of oil across no man's land. And there were groups of the engineers that would have been launching these. When they exploded, thick, choking smoke billowed over the German trenches. It was a calculated spectacle of fire and fog designed to blind the enemy and instill terror and mask the movement of the Canadian troops. The barrage was basically a symphony of destruction. It severed German communication lines, forced men into their dugouts, and disoriented even the most seasoned defenders. Yet the Germans were resilient. Machine gunners and snipers emerged from bunkers, braving the inferno to unleash deadly fire. Counter battery units scrambled to silence the Canadian guns, while reserves prepared to launch immediate counterattacks. Germans were well known for their counterattacks, and in the 10 days that followed, they counterattacked 21 times. The battlefield became a brutal contest of endurance and adaptation. Supporting units, engineers like Alexander Milburn, had spent days preparing for this moment. Their saps and communication trenches allowed troops to move under cover, basically. Their reinforced dugouts absorbed shockwaves, and their signaling posts pierced the chaos with vital coordination. Though not in the spotlight, the engineers' work was everywhere. It was quiet, critical, and enduring. Their designs held firm as German artillery retaliated. Their trenches guided soldiers through smoke and confusion, and their ingenuity gave the Canadian Corps the edge it needed to withstand the storm. In the cacophony of battle, the engineers were the invisible backbone of the offensive. So, as the artillery roared and the Livens projectors hurled burning oil into enemy lines, thick smoke rolled across the battlefield, masking the advance and creating confusion. Alexander, my great grandfather, his section likely moved through the trench sectors designated on the trench maps as H31C and N1B. They were forward saps hastily dug toward the German lines. Their task was critical and dangerous, laying coils of barbed wire to shape the battlefield, installing duckboards over mud and craters to allow infantry movement, and reinforcing communication routes under the threat of counter battery fire and sniper rounds. At this point now, I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the more human side of what was going on that morning, the uncertainty of loss. So, at some point in the morning hours of August 15th, 1917, amid the chaos of the Canadian assault on Hill 70, Sapper Alexander Richardson Milburn was killed while consolidating a newly captured strong point north of the city of Lens. The exact circumstances of his death remained shrouded in the fog of war. There were no named witnesses to his final moments, and no grave marks the place where he fell. His body was never recovered, likely lost in the churned earth of no man's land or buried beneath rubble. His name now appears among those listed with no known grave, etched into the stone of the Vimy Memorial alongside thousands of Canadians who'd vanished into the soil of France. His service record simply states that he died working north of Lens, a phrase that sort of implies the danger and urgency of his task. Alexander's contributions were a really important part of the operation, and the lines that held, the trenches that stood, the men who advanced with a fighting chance all bore the imprint of his labor. His legacy lives on not in medals or monuments alone, but in the quiet strength of the battlefield infrastructure that allowed others to survive and succeed. Now, I've said that there were no witnesses to his final moments. And this has always been my belief and the family's belief for 109 years. I'll get back to that. In the brutal calculus of war, his sacrifice was just one of thousands, but it wasn't anonymous. It was purposeful, enduring, it was deeply human, but still a mystery remained. So, for most of my life, I did not know how my great grandfather, Alexander Richardson Milburn, had died. His name is etched into the Vimy Memorial among thousands of Canadians with no known grave, and that's all I had. Just absence, just silence and sort of family rumors. But this past summer, while I was writing my first book, Ancestors Sitting Between Us, I accidentally uncovered details buried in war diaries and letters, fragments that finally revealed the truth. On the morning of August 15th, 1917, during the assault on Hill 70, he advanced with his section behind the creeping barrage. Major E.F. Lynn, his commanding officer, recorded what he saw in his diary. Quote, "The barrage began at 4:25 a.m. The ground shook like a drumskin. Our men moved forward with wire, duckboards, and picks. By 0600, the mud was waist deep. I watched Sapper Milburn's section disappear into the forward sap. He was cheerful, mud to his knees, rifle slung, wire spool over his shoulder. I remember thinking he looked like a man walking into a storm." End quote. Hours later, at 9:10 a.m., a shell struck the sap entrance. 3 men were killed instantly. My great-grandfather was among them. Major Lynn wrote, quote, "I sent 2 men to recover what they could. They returned with his spool and a torn tunic. I wrote his name in my field book. I did not know him well, but I will not forget him." End quote. The war diary entry for that day is stark, almost clinical. Acting Lieutenant Corporal Scott, Sappers Milburn, and Gemmell are killed in action while 23 other ranks are more or less seriously wounded. And then, a week later, a letter arrived in Iberville, Quebec, addressed to Alexander's wife, Mary, my great-grandmother. It carried the grief of official words. I'm going to read this to you now. And it's addressed to her, and it starts, quote, "I am grieved to have to inform you of the death of your husband, who was killed in action on the morning of August 15th, 1917, during our attack and capture of Hill 70 in front of Loos, or Loss. Your husband was taking part in the consolidation of our newly captured position when he was killed. Although your husband had only been with us a few months, he had proved his great worth, and his death is a distinct loss to this company. I hope that, in the knowledge that he has paid the supreme sacrifice for God, country, and liberty, may help in a small way to relieve you of the great load of sorrow you have been called upon to bear. Should you desire further details regarding his death, I will be glad to supply them at any time. I have the honor to be, Madam, yours respectfully, E.F. Lynn, Major, Canadian Engineers Commanding 2nd Field Company. End quote. For decades, all I had was the knowledge that he never came home. But now I can see him, mud to his knees, wire spool over his shoulder, walking into the storm. So his death was no longer anonymous. It was recorded in the hand of his commanding officer, remembered in the diary of his company, and carried across the ocean in a letter of sorrow. The mystery was solved, and with it, his story is restored. Alexander had a tight circle of friends back home in Iberville, Quebec, many of them also having come from Scotland, around Galloway, and also stonecutters by trade, because that's what you did in Dalbeattie or Galloway. That was the industry. One friend in particular was called John McCaig. Now, the family story goes that while Alexander chose to enlist, his pal John McCaig did not. Why, I don't know. What I do know is that the two men made a deal. Alexander asked his friend for the ultimate favor. If he should not return from the war, he wanted John McCaig to look after his family. Remember, he had 7 children at home. McCaig agreed, and when the news of Alexander's death arrived and my great-grandmother stopped receiving her late husband's pay allowance, John McCaig kept his word and married Alexander's widow. My great-grandmother, Marianne Milburn, became Marianne McCaig. John and Mary went on to have their own child, quite late in life for both of them, in 1919, a son named Crawford, who sadly did not survive infancy. Mary died in 1934 and is buried in the family cemetery at Trinity Church in Iberville. So I want to talk now a little bit about how all of this affected a history nerd like me and why all of this carries so much weight. My fellow history nerds will identify with this, I'm sure. Writing began as something I did to remember, but it also became something I did to listen, not to myself exactly, but to the quiet, to the lineage woven into my bloodstream. Language, I've come to understand, is not just self-expression. It's a conversation with the ones who came before, if you can listen between the lines. The last time I saw my grandmother, Maggie, Alexander's daughter, I was 13 and she was 82. And she still carried his absence like an ember. It was just the two of us that summer weekend in 1987, tucked into the quiet of her old house in Cartierville, Quebec. My paternal grandmother was slight and warm, and her hands were always soft, and her voice was still laced with the Scottish accent she never quite lost. She made us a dinner with sweet baby peas, as always, and lemon meringue pie for dessert, her signature. She invited me into that moment the way one opens a door to a shrine. The afternoon unfolded like a ritual. We sat together, just the two of us, on a bedroom floor next to her old steamer trunk. Probably the same trunk she came across the Atlantic with back in 1911 when she was 6 years old. She opened the trunk and showed me what she called treasures, and they were black and white photographs, my father's tiny bronze baby shoes, pressed flowers, letters faded with ink. And then, tenderly and tearfully, she spoke of her daddy, Alexander, who never came home, killed in the war when she was only 12. Her voice trembled with the grief of a lifetime. Killed at Hill 70, she said, gripping that truth as if it might dissolve if not spoken aloud. You must remember, she told me, pressing the weight of that loss into my hands. Hill 70. I didn't know what that meant when I was 13. I didn't know how big this hill was. I didn't know if there was a number 70 on it. I knew nothing. And it was the first time I'd ever heard about my great grandfather. So it wasn't just the object she shared, it was grief. A grief that held tenderly for 7 decades. She was 12 when it happened, and somehow still 12 when she told me. She spoke with urgency, sorrow, and something else fury. She was still angry, righteously angry. Her heartbreak hadn't faded, it had deepened into a kind of armor. The Germans, she snapped, eyes glinting behind tears, can go pee up their kilts. I remember laughing through the ache in my chest. It was the kind of sentence only she could say, sharp and tender, rage braided with devotion. Her eyes welled up, and I saw she'd carried that wound her whole life. Her Scottish accent, still intact enough to inflect every syllable, softened and cracked around his name. She hadn't lost a soldier, she'd lost her daddy. So let's go back now to Lens, France, August 1917. The War Diary of the 2nd Field Company, Canadian Engineers, stated bridge over communication trench collapsed due to rain and shell impact. Rebuilt overnight. 2 sappers wounded. From the diary of Major E.F. Lynn, commanding officer of the 2nd Field Company, this is dated August 17, 1917. The men are exhausted. We've rebuilt the trench bridge twice in 24 hours. Shells fall with a rhythm now. I've lost 3 men this week. 1 drowned in a crater. I cannot forget the sound. End quote. Major Lynn's private papers, held by the Imperial War Museum, offers a rare glimpse into the emotional toll of command. There is a fragment of a letter written by Sapper Thomas McLeod of the 2nd Field Company. The date is 20th of August, 1917. And he said, quote, "We built a duckboard path last night. Took us 6 hours. It's already gone, blown apart by morning. I don't know why we keep building. Maybe because it's all we can do." End quote. This letter fragment, tucked into a bundle of daily orders from Military District 2, was never sent. It was found folded inside McLeod's kit after he was killed on August 22nd, 1917. The success of August 15th came at a price, and that price for my family was paid in its entirety the very next day. The German High Command considered Lens vital, and they resolved to take Hill 70 at any cost. So here we are now on August 16th, 1917. The ridge, captured only hours before, it became a killing ground. The Canadian Corps, commanded by Arthur Currie, deliberately turned Hill 70 into a trap. They had the high ground, the prepared trenches, and the artillery spotters. Their strategy was harsh but effective. Hold the line and let the German counterattacks bleed themselves dry. The 75th Battalion, to which Private William Glendenning Milburn belonged, was positioned right in the heart of this storm. For 24 hours, German forces launched at least 7 massive counterattacks. The ridge was pounded by nonstop artillery, and the infantry faced relentless waves of assault. Grenades flew, bayonets were fixed, and the men fought knee-deep in mud, often in desperate close-quarter combat. Now remember that by 1917, continuous shelling and heavy rains had turned the earth into a sea of mud. So during the Battle of Hill 70, British and Canadian troops found themselves struggling against more than just enemy fire. They were also fighting the terrain. The bombardments had destroyed drainage systems, turning even light rain into deadly, muddy quagmire. Duckboards provided some refuge, but stepping off of them meant risking complete immersion as the mud clung heavily and suffocatingly. Moving became painful. Artillery sank in the mud, horses flailed, and soldiers' boots could be pulled off and swallowed by the earth. Many drowned in flooded shell holes, while others froze, unable to advance under relentless machine gun fire. Photographs captured hollow-eyed soldiers hauling stretchers across duckboards, their uniforms caked with that yellowish clay of the wet earth. In letters home, they spoke of the silence between barrages, of boots that never dried, of comrades buried not by shrapnel but by soil. Here are some excerpts from letters written by Canadian soldiers who fought in France during that summer, especially near Lens and during the Battle of Hill 70. These letters have been preserved through projects like the Canadian Letters and Images Project and reflect the emotional weight and daily realities of war. So again, we hear from Private James Clancy. He was with the 78th Battalion of the Winnipeg Grenadiers, and this is written on the 20th of August, 1917. Quote, "We are back from Hill 70, and I am sore in every bone. The mud is incredible, sticky and deep. You'd think we were wading through porridge. I saw 2 men buried when a shell struck beside them and the muck closed in over their heads like water. It's not the bullets we fear, it's the ground itself." Sergeant William Henry Billings of the 13th Battalion, the Royal Highlanders of Canada, wrote on August 17th, "I have never seen such a desolation. The fields are blasted, the trees gone. Duckboards are our lifeline, and if you step off, you vanish. Yesterday, I saw a horse pulled under in a crater so deep it swallowed its weight before we could even reach him. The air is thick with cordite and smoke, and our boots never truly dry." Private George McFarlane of the 16th Battalion, Canadian Scottish Regiment, wrote August 18th, "We have taken the hill. It's a bitter victory. So many gone. The mud makes everything harder. It slows the stretchers, it clogs the rifles, and it drags on our nerves. But the lads are brave, and we will hold this place. I miss home. I miss quiet. I miss you." The 75th Battalion held their ground on August 16th, 1917, but the human cost was staggering. Amidst this desperate, relentless fighting, Private William Glendenning Milburn was killed in action. He was only 21 years old. His son was born in March of 1917, just months before William had crossed from England into France with the 75th Battalion. So he never met his baby boy. When he fell at Hill 70, his body was buried close to where he died, likely in a battlefield grave marked only by a rudimentary cross or perhaps not marked at all. The chaos of battle left very little room for ceremony. It wasn't until years later, during the post-war clearance operations of 1920, that his remains were actually discovered and identified. He was reburied with honor in the Liven Communal Cemetery Extension in Pas-de-Calais, France. His headstone bears the inscription chosen by his widow, "Until the day breaks, ever remembered by his wife Flora." His name is commemorated in Canada's Book of Remembrance, inscribed in the virtual War Memorial, and remembered on the Barrie Cenotaph and the Innisfil Memorial in Ontario. Yet in some ways, his memory slipped quietly into silence. His widow, Flora, remarried in 1919, as so many did out of necessity, and their infant son took his stepfather's surname. William's story was rarely spoken of. Perhaps the pain was too great, perhaps because silence was easier than remembrance. For me, as a family member and genealogist, William's story seemed buried for nearly 130 years. I saw a photograph of him for the first time less than a year ago, and what struck me most was how much he resembles my own son. His mother, my great-grandfather's sister, died prematurely at age 45, her death certificate listing apoplexy, which is what we now call a stroke. She lost both her brother Alexander and her son William in the same battle, a single day apart. The weight of that loss must have been unbearable. So I've often wondered if death came early because of the stress and the devastating loss she faced in life. It must have been painfully overwhelming. To add to the mystery, I had heard suggestions that she might have had a child out of wedlock, something that would have brought great shame to the family. However, the rumors remain unconfirmed and difficult to verify, as in those days, great care was taken to leave no evidence that could tarnish the family's reputation. In those cases, it was extremely common for the young unwed mother to move away from the family, give the child up, make zero mention of the biological father's name, and often the young mother would make herself disappear from record as well. She would marry quietly and take on a new husband's name, and the matter would never be spoken of again. In other cases, the young woman chose to have and keep her baby with the absolute support of her family. To do this without bringing unwelcomed attention and shame in their direction, it was often claimed that the woman's husband had died or simply left and did not return. The child would then be informally adopted, usually by the young woman's father, and the child might be raised as her sibling. Or her own father would provide her and the child with necessities, a surname, and therefore justifying the baby's existence. This is the case in William Glendenning Milburn's past. His mother gave birth to him at age 24, not terribly young in 1897, though there is still a persisting family rumor that she also gave birth to a daughter 2 years earlier. I have never found any mention or record of William's father, census, marriage, or otherwise, and conveniently there is no record of William Glendanning's birth that lists the father's name. He was baptized, yes, but W.G. Milburn, his maternal grandfather, is listed as his father on that document and on all subsequent documents, including his service record in the Great War. It is my understanding that Flora didn't speak about him much or often. Perhaps it was just easier to move on. Their infant son subsequently took on her new husband's surname and was not raised as a Milburn. Thus, William Glendanning's memories seemed to quietly slip into oblivion, much as his remains likely did into the mud and the mire and the shell holes of France. So going back to the logistics of Hill 70, in an attempt to draw German troops away from the Ypres sector, a diversionary attack was planned to take place to the south of the Lons-Luz area. This assault was to be primarily conducted by the Canadian Corps plus the British 46th North Midland Division. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie took command of the Canadian Corps in June of 1917, following their victory at Vimy Ridge. He replaced the British General Julian Byng. Currie was the first Canadian put in charge of the Corps, Canada's main fighting force on the Western Front. In July, Currie received orders from Sir Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of all British-led forces in Western Europe, to seize the French coal mining city of Lens. Haig aimed to divert German forces away from the ongoing measured Allied offensive at Passchendaele, Belgium. Currie considered Hill 70 an elevation on Lens's outskirts, named for its 70-meter height above sea level, more tactically significant. Currie believed that a straightforward frontal attack on Lens, followed by the Allies occupying the city, would be useless if Germans could fire down at the Canadians from the high hills. Therefore, Currie persuaded his superiors, including Haig, to change the attack plan, targeting Hill 70 as the Canadians' primary objective. Currie thought that capturing the hill would pressure surrounding German positions, prompting them to emerge from their dugouts for attack. The Canadians could then inflict heavy damage and push the Germans out of the area. During late July and early August, while preparing for the assault on Hill 70, the Canadians engaged in harassment and distraction tactics against the German forces. The Battle of Hill 70 served its purpose. It inflicted between 20 and 30,000 German casualties. The Canadians had depleted 7 German divisions. Artillery forward observation officers moved forward with the infantry, and the artillery observation aircraft flew overhead and sent 240 calls for artillery fire by wireless. 10 battalions from the Canadian 1st and 2nd Divisions advanced up the hill. Although they took their initial objectives in just 20 minutes, the final objectives were not captured until about 5:15 p.m. on 16 August. Brigadier General Frederick Loomis, commander of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, stated, I wish to report that the fighting which took place from the crest of Hill 70 forward on this brigade frontage was the finest and most bitter which the battalions of this brigade have ever experienced or seen." End quote. So on August 15th, by 9 o'clock a.m., the Germans began their series of counterattacks. Over the following 3 days, that's 3 days, 21 counterattacks were launched, which, with much of the German effort focused on Canadian artillery. The Canadian 1st and 2nd Artillery Field Brigades, as well as the Canadian front line, were heavily exposed to gas, with the Germans using a new type called Yellow Cross, containing the blistering agent sulfur mustard, also known as mustard gas. Many artillery personnel were injured when the gas fogged their respirator goggles, forcing them to remove masks to maintain accurate fire. German troops with flamethrowers managed to break through the Canadian line before being expelled. In the case of William Glendenning Milburn, we don't know his exact circumstances of death on August 16th. It may have been artillery, machine gun fire, mustard gas, or by a flamethrower. We will likely never know. German infantry faced intense enemy fire, described as, quote, "fountains of earth sent up by the heavy shells," and "a hail of shrapnel and machine gun bullets," end quote, according to the history of the German 5th Foot Guard Regiment, resulting in their destruction. The Canadians eventually captured the heights of Hill 70, but the cost was high. By the end of only the first day, which was August 15th, 1,056 Canadians were dead, 2,432 were wounded, and 39 had been taken prisoner. It's not known how many Germans died that day. Arthur Lapointe, a signaller with the 22nd Battalion, wrote in his journal, quote, "Dead bodies lie half buried under the fallen parapet, and wounded are writhing in convulsions of pain. They lie in a mass of gray with blood splashed all around." End quote. As Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig recorded in his diary on 21 August, quote, "These 2 Canadian divisions have knocked out 7 German divisions. The 7th, 220th, 4th Guard, 1st Guard Reserve," and then he writes in brackets, "these are 4 of the very best divisions in the German army. 11th Reserve, 36th Reserve, these are not so good, and 8th Division, also very good." The fact is itself an indication of the enemy's morale. That these 2 Canadian divisions are now in such a fine state is due to having ample reserves to replace casualties, i.e., the result of sound organization. End quote. So, in not so many words, he's praising Arthur Currie. The Battle of Hill 70 lasted from August 15th to August 25, 1917. About 9,000 Canadians were killed or wounded in the overall battle, while an estimated 25,000 Germans were killed or wounded. The lives of many Canadian soldiers were saved by the work of one Private Michael O'Rourke, an Irish-born Canadian stretcher-bearer. He received the Victoria Cross for repeatedly running into German fire to rescue wounded Canadians. Major O'Kill Massey Learmonth of Quebec jumped onto a parapet and threw hand grenades at the enemy during a German counterattack on 18 August. The 23-year-old officer caught German grenades and threw them back. Learmonth was wounded and later died and was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Another 4 Canadians received the Victoria Cross for bravery at Hill 70, the British Empire's highest award for military valor. They were Private Harry Brown, Sergeant Frederick Hobson, Company Sergeant Major Robert Hill Hanna, and Corporal Philip Carnawall. Pardon me. That's 6 Victoria Crosses in all. The fighting at Hill 70, less famous than Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele, is lesser known to many Canadians, never mind the rest of the world. However, some historians consider Hill 70 one of Canada's most significant World War I contributions, even more important than Vimy Ridge. It was altogether the hardest battle in which the Corps had participated, wrote Currie himself. It was a great and wonderful victory. General Headquarters regard it as one of the finest performances of the war. End quote. Thanks to Currie's tactics, the battle ended in a German defeat, forcing Germany to divert resources from Passchendaele. This victory, after Vimy, boosted Canada's pride and reputation. It established the Canadian Corps as a formidable force in the British Army, a reputation Canadians upheld under Currie's leadership in 1917 and 1918. Canada's sacrifices, such as the nearly 1,900 soldiers who died at Hill 70, are honored today at the Hill 70 Memorial and the Loos British Cemetery outside of Lens, France. The names of Canadians who died at Hill 70 without known graves are also inscribed on the larger memorial at Vimy Ridge. So, what still amazes me is how it all came down to just 24 hours. Alexander and William, uncle and nephew, gone within a day of each other in the same battle. 2 lives, 2 generations, cut short on the same ridge in France. Alexander's name is carved into the Vimy Memorial, one of those thousands with no known grave. William was reburied later at Lieven with a headstone that carries his wife Flora's words. Different endings, but both tied to the same ground and the same storm. And when I think about them now, it's not just about the war, it's about family. About how their stories slipped into silence for decades, and how easy it is for memory to fade when grief is too heavy to carry, and how that inevitably shapes future generations like myself. But here they are again, my Milburn men, side by side, their names finally spoken aloud. So that's what I mean when I say that ancestors are sitting between us. They're not just figures in a history book. They're part of the conversation, part of the lineage that shapes who we are. And by telling their story, we keep them here. Not forgotten, not anonymous, but remembered as men who lived, who worked, who loved, and who gave everything in those 2 terrible days at Hill 70. Thank you for joining me on this podcast. I appreciate each and every one of you who takes the time to listen, and I thank you for visiting my website at www.memoryandvalor.ca. If you'd like to learn more about Hill 70, please check out the podcast section of the website. I also regularly post short readings from different books to keep the content flowing. And these can be found on the updates and post page of the website, as well as on my Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok pages. They're all titled Memory and Valor, making them easy to find. And remember, that's valor with an O-U-R. Please take a moment to like, follow, share, rate this podcast, and share any content you enjoy. That would be great. It really helps not only raise an awareness, especially among younger generations who may not know these stories, but it again keeps memories alive. My books are also available for purchase on Amazon, and additionally, I offer a service to create legacy books, sort of an immersive and meaningful way to honor your loved ones, military or not. Your involvement in these projects helps keep history alive. So, lest we forget. Next time on Memory and Valor, I think we'll step into no man's land. No man's land was more than mud and wire. This was a place of dread. Soldiers stepping into that desolate stretch of land between the 2 front lines carried the weight of fear. Fear of snipers hidden in the dark, of shells that could fall without warning, of never returning to the trench alive. In that eerie landscape, superstition grew. Some swore they saw ghostly figures drifting through the mist. Others clutched good luck charms, a coin, a Bible, a lock of hair, fragile shields against the terror that surrounded them. And believe me, there were lots of times you had to go into no man's land when there was no battle going on, especially at night. So please join me as we explore the haunted world of no man's land and the fear, the faith, and fragile hope that shaped the soldier's experience in the face of war's uncertainty. Until then, keep history alive, for where memory endures, valor lives on.